Hello and welcome back to another Blurble Reasoning. Today we are discussing The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells, which I've just read in full for the first time. However, I do have a bit of a history with this story, which we will go over very quickly. My first exposure to The War of the Worlds was via Jeff Wayne's musical version, which we listened to in primary school. I remember we all got grouped up, we all went into one of the classrooms and we just sat down and we listened through it. I don't know if we listened to the whole thing because I think it's like 2 hours long. Lessons were an hour long, but all the same, it was considered, a worthwhile thing to have us listen through, and we were told about the history of it and how there was a broadcast radio version of this in 1938, I believe it was, and how people thought it was real. As it turns out, I conflated these two things in my head, and up until just now when I went and researched this, I thought it was the musical version which had been transmitted over the radio that people thought was real, and I was a little confused as to why people thought that an actual news broadcast about an invasion of Martians would be accompanied with lots of really cool music and singing. But yes, Jeff Wayne's musical version of War of the Worlds can be found in full on YouTube, and while that is not the version of the story that I am talking about today, I do recommend going and giving it a listen if you have the time. Ba 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 ba-da-da, ba 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 ba-da-da. It's iconic, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's the version of War of the Worlds that the most people are familiar with at this point. I also watched the 2005 movie The War of the Worlds with Tom Cruise, or I think that's just called War of the Worlds, and I watched that when I was like 11 or 12 maybe at my aunt and uncle's house. And look, I haven't seen it since, alright? It might not be scary. I was quite a sensitive kid when it came to like being scared about things. I mean, I've grown into an adult with generalized anxiety disorder, so that tracks. But that movie scared the shit out of me. I remember we all went to bed that night and my family was going, oh yeah, what a great movie. Oh wow, what a great version of War of the Worlds. And then there was just me in my bed, eyes wide open, the horrors playing back in my head. Oh god, what if Martians really did invade Earth? We would be helpless. So that's my history with the War of the Worlds. But I had never read the original thing by H.G. Wells, published in 1898, I believe. So I decided to. I listened to the H.G. Wells science fiction collection available on Audible, narrated by David Tennant, this particular book within the collection, which I believe is unabridged from the original novel. And I'll say up front, I'm coming at this novel from kind of two perspectives. The first perspective is obviously just the face value, the story, the science fiction story about the Martians invading Earth, and this one unnamed protagonist's accounting of it. At least I don't think we ever hear his name. And just appreciating it for the story that it is. And then the other aspect I'm coming at this from is just as a historical story, because this was written between 1895 and 1898 if my research is to be believed, and that makes it not just fascinating because it's one of the earliest science fiction stories with alien invasions and all that, which we see millions of disaster movies being made of today. That might be a slight exaggeration, but it's also just fascinating, and you might have to bear with me here, because I haven't read many novels from the 19th century, and so I found little bits of fascination within everyday little things which the readers of the time would have just taken as, setting. I think my favourite thing is how there was some discussion in book 2, because this was originally split into book 1 and book 2. I'm kind of grouping them together as a single book here, as most people do these days. There was a bit of discussion about the Martians trying to build a flying machine, and that would be scary because then they would be able to dominate the world even faster than they were already doing. But I didn't really stop to consider it until the very end when he says, after the Martians have been spoilers, the Martians get defeated. I know, it's wild. And he talks about how there's a paper out saying that the secret of flight has been discovered by, examining the Martian craft that they were making. And I went, wait. When did the Wright brothers happen? And I googled it, and it was like 4 or 5 years after this novel came out. And people talk a lot about how H.G. Wells predicted the future in scarily accurate ways, like predicted the far future, like our modern day, the kind of things that are happening in society now. And I guess that's more impressive, but I think it's also really funny that he predicted flight being discovered like a few years before it actually happened. I wonder if there are any faster examples of a science fiction invention being devised and it becoming true. I mean, I'm sure it was because there were lots of people trying to discover the secret of flight at the time, and he probably just pulled from current events for that, but you know, it was definitely interesting. But yeah, as a historical text, I think one of the major things that stuck out to me about the invasion of the Martians was the fact that this was a pre-World War text. H.G. Wells had no way of knowing that this massive global conflict was going to erupt and these new weapons of mass destruction were going to be discovered and invented and brought to bear against each other, and there would be a death toll in the horrible numbers. But the actual Martian invasion and the destruction they wrought and the technological superiority of them, and the kind of like imagery invoked of like just the destruction of the horror and the terror, it did make me think of World War II specifically, to be fair, but the World Wars. There is a specific line where he says, "Never before in the history of warfare had destruction been so indiscriminate and so universal," and that definitely made me go, yeah, that was a fucking pre-World War line if I've ever read one. But there was also the line in the previous chapter, something very like the war fever that occasionally runs through a civilized community had got into my blood. That also struck me as pre-World War One, because something that you hear a lot about with World War One was the idea of becoming a soldier to go and fight the enemy and be a great hero. And then I feel like the myth of I mean, like, it's not a myth, like, soldiers were heroes, don't get me wrong, of course they were, but like the myth of like joining the army to become a great hero, I feel like that died with World War One. I don't know if that's like a universal thing, but that's the way I perceive it anyway. And I feel like that line being here definitely, again, is another thing that points to this being a pre-World War narrative. It's not just conflict, though. There are other things which I found quaint, which pointed to me that this is a very old text at this point. And I think the thing that makes it most fascinating, by the way, because you might be like, Christian, there are stories from earlier than this, you've read Shakespeare, all this stuff. I think it's because it's so on the cusp of being a recognizable modern day world, and yet it's just far enough into the past that it's not an era I'm super familiar with, and there are things that take me by surprise, like the reminder that aviation hasn't been born yet. But then there are other things which strike out as being super familiar to me, like the Daily Mail and the Telegraph and all that stuff. But also, as a work of science fiction, this is undoubtedly going to be based on old theories which were disproven in the time between the novel and the present. And don't get me wrong, I am not up to date on my history of astronomy, which, by the way, is something that this book has stoked in me. I want to learn about the history of astronomy and see what we used to think and how we learned what we know now, and the kind of like path that got us from there to here. And yeah, anyway, that's a tangent, but it's insinuated in this book that Mars has seas, like seas of water. And I think it's interesting that Mars is known to be this red planet because of the color it emits in the sky, but they don't know why it's red, and they kind of assume it's just got red flora on it, like red life, and obviously that would be assuming life. And I think that's another thing that's so interesting about this text is, how much about outer space and the thought of life beyond Earth was in the public consciousness at the time. Because obviously it's something H.G. Wells thought about. He wrote bloody War of the Worlds, but like, within the text, what do people in the story know and believe about space and potential aliens? Because really, aliens didn't emerge into pop culture and collective consciousness the way they are now until, I believe, like the 50s, right? Like with the Roswell crash, or the alleged Roswell crash and all that. Let me know if I'm wrong there, but I am fascinated by like the growing, like, obviously Since time immemorial, man has looked up at the stars and wondered, are we alone? I know that, but how many people did that? How many people considered it? Because I'm still struck today by the idea that most people don't give too much thought about the insane scale of the universe. Like, I'm not just talking about the potential for life out there, but just how much space there is, and the fact that we exist here within it. And that is something that I think about a lot, and that is something that I don't think a lot of people think about a lot. It's just an interest of mine. And that's the vibe I got regarding alien life within this text. And I think that was supposed to be indicative of the general feeling back in the day. It was probably a thing, just much more of a niche interest back then. And I like how this story is about Martian invasion. You get the impression it's supposed to reflect colonialism and, first world countries invading third world countries and the way they treat the denizens of those third world countries back in the day. And let's be real, still a bit today too. And I think a lot of this story is about this fear of, what if we got treated the way we treat the others? And don't get me wrong, the way this book describes less advanced peoples and cultures isn't exactly up to snuff with how we would talk about things, but it is also, a product of its time, and I think I can see what it was trying to get at enough to trust it. That being said, there are definitely some things within this text which you can kind of point to the time that it was written in and say, yeah, those are some kind of things that we would consider problematic things today. Such as the fact that we get such a detailed accounting of his brothers fleeing and survival, but we don't get a single word from his wife, we don't get her name, we don't get her story, we don't get anything. She just exists within the narrative to be, something that the protagonist might have lost. Yes, this story is a product of its time, and there's a lot more like that as well, like, shame over the idea of a man crying and all that stuff. I know it's a product of its time. I'm not necessarily going to condemn it for that, but I'm not gonna pretend that didn't stick out to me. But yeah, to talk about the story itself, I guess, the invasion itself, 12 minutes into this review. I mean, obviously, I already knew the general story of the War of the Worlds, having listened to it in primary school and watched a movie of it shortly thereafter, as well as just the public understanding of this extremely famous piece of work. The Martians invade, humanity does a really bad job of fighting back because of the technological advancements of the Martians. They get pretty much stomped, and then the Martians all catch a cold and die. Yes, that is the story of War of the Worlds. We all know it. But this book was really good, because I think my number one takeaway from this book is the imagery, because ultimately not a whole lot happens in this book. It's a lot of lingering explanations and painting other pictures, and that might sound like it has the potential to be boring, but it's really not. We spend a lot of time looking at a familiar world-made alien in more ways than one, both through the destruction of the surrounding towns and of London, and just like charred buildings which are often likened to bones and very much setting as character there. The protagonist makes it very clear how weird it is to see these parts of home through the lens of just destruction and death. We also have the Martian flora, specifically the red weed, kind of terraforming the landscape. I don't think terraforming was really a concept back then, and even within the narrative it's stated that we don't know if that was an intentional thing that the Martians brought with them or a mistake, it just happened to land with them. But the landscape becomes more Martian as the Martians gain a stronger foothold on it. The red weed kind of takes over the landscape, makes it red. There's kind of like a red haze in the air after a while, and H.G. Wells does such a good job of evoking this imagery of an alien world overtaking the real world. And there are some haunting scenes within this book as well. The two which spring to mind, first of all, I will say, I'll order them in terms of which ones I like more. First of all, the one that came later, the scene with the curate where the protagonist was hiding. I'm pretty sure this was also a scene in the movie. It was probably done a bit differently. I think there was a whole family there. But they're hiding in that house where the sixth ship crashed into, I think. And they hide there for like 2 weeks, trying not to make a sound, rationing food, arguing with each other, kind of slowly losing their minds. And then the curate loses his mind, like, fully, and goes running and yelling, and I believe the protagonist kills him. Either he kills him or he knocks him unconscious, and then the Martian kills him, and then the protagonist kind of took that in his own mind as him killing him, which I was relieved came up again later as he kind of quote-unquote put himself on trial and looked back over it and tried to see if there was anything he could have done differently, because before that scene I was like, hey, you kind of just killed that man, huh? Like, I get he had to, but, you know, man should have been a little traumatized by that, and man was actually quite traumatized by that. But anyway, the protagonist hiding from the kind of tentacles and tendrils exploring the house, that was a very tense scene. That was done very well. But my absolute favorite scene before that was when they were trying to flee, and they were fleeing down the street, and there was just an absolute like stampede of civilians fleeing for their lives from this onslaught of Martians, and just the way they were depicted, like, again, this like familiar and domestic place and people made strange, made almost alien in themselves, with trauma and fear and all that stuff. And there was a scene of the man driving a cart over people and he broke someone's back, and it's like these horrors, these terrible things that should not be happening within this civilized community becoming uncivilized, becoming feral, becoming hunted. That scene, I think, will stay with me. I think that was such a good depiction of just like such a good microcosm. Is that how you use that word? I've never used the word microcosm before, everyone, but that, you know, just like the grand narrative packed into a single scene. Like, yeah, it was so good. Sometimes you read a classic bit of fiction, right, and you know it's a classic, and you know that it's beloved, and you know it was extremely important for the genre and for literature as a whole, but you just can't quite bring yourself to love it. You can't quite bring yourself to give it that 5 out of 5. War of the Worlds isn't one of those. War of the Worlds gets a 5 out of 5 from me, just in terms of sheer enjoyment and fascination. War of the Worlds isn't just a classic that I can point to and go, that was really important and did a lot of crazy things, and I respect it for that. It's also a book I can point to and say, cracking good read. Give it a go. I do want to read the rest of this collection, which, if you are wondering, I'm clicking on it right now. This is really professional. Next up is The First Men in the Moon, followed by The Time Machine, followed by The Invisible Man, followed by The Island of Dr. Moreau, all narrated by different people. I'm not going to read them all back to back. I'm going to give this a bit of a break, but I am going to come back and revisit these at some point in the future and read some more H.G. Wells, just because I would love to go back in time and see these very prescient works of science fiction written in the late 19th century to the early 20th century. There are some stories which had such a profound effect on everything which came after that you kind of owe it to yourself as a fan of a genre to go back and look at the origins of some of these ideas. So thanks for joining me on this detour. This was a Between Sandersons read. I've been reading through the Cosmere, if that interests you. I've got reviews on my channel for that. I'll probably dive back into that now, but I just wanted a quick science fiction aside, and honestly, I don't regret it. Thanks for hanging out. One thing I'm going to do is I'm going to post my full notes. For the first time since reading some of the Wheel of Time books, I started taking notes, just because I watched a video where someone said, oh, it really helps you, interface with the narrative and the text a little better. And I agree. And I took so many notes that I never ended up using in this video, because that's just the nature of making a video. You want to kind of have a thread of things to talk about, and some things don't make the cut. So I'm going to leave my full notes on a chapter by chapter basis, either in the description below or a link to it in the description below, depending on what the character limit is. So if that interests you, go check that out. But in the meantime, thanks for checking this out, and I will catch you in whatever I make next.